French in the Ohio River Valley, because colonies like Massachusetts and Virginia had been speculating in that area for land. They wanted to claim that land. They believed that it was theirs rather than French. And this was one of the causes of the clashes that led to the French Indian War. Well, now you have all this great land available. But the British don't want the colonists to move there. Why? Native Americans. And so there's a lot of Native American groups that had either previously lived there or had moved there when you had a lot of European settlement on the East Coast. And so you have powerful groups like the Shawnee and the Miami Indians and the Iroquois and others that still basically had a lot of influence there and are going to resist white encroachment. In fact, right after the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, there was an uprising among the Ottawa Indians, and they attacked British forts, like Fort Detroit. The leader of this was a guy named Pontiac. And so the British suppressed Pontiac's rebellion, but it sent a message that, like, hey, we've got to do something about this. So the king creates the Proclamation Line of 1763. It says basically, colonists, do not move across this line. Colonists aren't going to like that. They felt that, like, you know, they had fought in the French and Indian War and had a right to gain these lands. Also, following the war, now you're under King George III, and the king is going to want to find ways to pay for the great debt that Great Britain got into in the war. They had basically went in a large amount of national debt paying for this war, and even though a lot of the colonists paid for it, I mean, they fought in it, the idea was that they would fight and provide troops, but the British would pay for it. That was Lord Pitt's compromise. So, after the war, they're going to try to find ways to pay for the war and to pay for an army that they believe was being stationed in North America to protect the colonists. But the colonists saw it differently. Why do they think that these army forces are being put in their towns?
To like police them.
To police them and to make sure that they are following the Navigation Acts and not smuggling, which they had been doing. So, starting in 1760, 1764, the British Parliament starts passing these laws which were seen by the colonists as harmful to them. The Sugar Act, for example, put a high tax on molasses imported from the French islands. And the French islands were someone that the colonists liked trading with a lot. The French bought a lot of our lumber and salted fish and tobacco and things. Smugglers began to be arrested. Britain started setting up vice admiralty courts so that smugglers wouldn't be heard by a local jury, they would be heard by a British officer. They often had property searched with these warrants called writs of assistance. But in 1765, things really start to change with the imposition of the Stamp Act. Because previous to this, the Sugar Act, the Molasses Act, that mostly impacted people that were importing things. So it mostly impacted merchants. And they certainly passed the costs on to customers, but people weren't as aware of it. Now, with the Stamp Act, this was a direct tax on the people. They had to pay this tax in order to buy this purchased paper, which was necessary for all types of legal documents and newspapers and you name it. So, the Stamp Act led to an uprising among the people. This was when the Sons of Liberty formed. The Parliament also passes things like the Quartering Act, saying that the colonies had to provide for the troops that were being stationed there. New York refuses to do it. And so they passed the Restraining Act and basically say, New York's legislature, you don't have a right to self-government until they pay for this Quartering Act. And so in response, you start to have these colonial leaders who had been indoctrinated into these Enlightenment ideas of self-rule, of freedom, of liberty, the idea of representation. You know, these people are very much against absolute monarchy. They don't like anything like that. And so they don't want to be, they want to have some say in their decisions. So you have John Dickinson writing letters from a Pennsylvania farmer. We looked at that. He was talking about the Stamp Act and the quarter Act. Anyone want to run and get me a diet soda from the teacher's lounge? Yeah. Oh, I need that. Great. All right. Keep the change.
Wait, you can get a diet soda for $1 in the teacher's lounge?
Maybe it's more.
No, it's literally, I've done it. It's like 75 cents.
You've done what? Okay.
Oh, wait.
Yeah, it's by the cafeteria. It's like right before.
Wait, what?
All right.
No, but like, that's not like anything else.
So, the Stamp Act causes such a resistance that the colonies come together again, and they form the Stamp Act Congress in New York. And they send a declarations back to the king, like why they think that the Stamp Act is unfair. It also leads to new leaders. So for example, Patrick Henry in the Virginia House of Burgesses basically says that the Stamp Act is unfair. He even basically says the king is acting like a tyrant. And what really works though is not importation. By refusing to purchase British-made goods, this cripples British merchants, and they put a lot of pressure on Parliament, and the Stamp Act is repealed, right? But Parliament also says, with the Declaratory Act, well, we still declare that we have the rights to make any laws whatsoever we want over the colonists. And so the crisis dies down for a little bit, but the following year, Lord Townsend, he's a new prime minister, he starts putting special duties and taxes on certain items, tea, lead, paint. Again, there's a boycott. The Sons of Liberty are active in forcing merchants not to sell these products, not to buy them from the British. The Daughters of Liberty turn to making their own clothing in these spinning bees. And again, non-importation succeeds. By 1768, though, they send more and more troops over, occupying Boston, because Boston was seen as like the head of the resistance. They had always kind of done their own thing since their founding as Massachusetts Bay Colony. So in 1770, the Townsend duties were repealed, except for, I believe, like a small nominal tax on tea. But that was also the year in March 5th of 1770 with the Boston Massacre. There was a lot of antagonism because Boston troops were being stationed in the city. They were taking jobs away from Bostonians. A lot of them were Irish Catholics. And so this led to an incident where kids were throwing ice and oyster shells at soldiers, and guns went off, and basically there was the first people killed, some say, in the Revolution. Crispus Attucks, for example, was one. John Adams also becomes significant now because he represents the British soldiers and gets them off. But Sam Adams, his cousin, is also becoming prominent as the head of the Sons of Liberty. He forms the committees of correspondence linking the colonies and linking different towns to know what actions the British were up to. And by 1773, the Tea Act basically said that the Tea Act was created to help out a British company, the British East India Company. And it would allow them to sell their tea directly to the colonists. The price of other tea was raised so that it was out of reach of most colonists. So they basically either had to buy this special tea with a tax on it or nothing at all. In response, the Sons of Liberty start boycotting it, and they refuse to allow ships into the harbor containing the tea. And in Boston, they actually dump the tea overboard. This is known as the Boston Tea Party. This leads to the coercive acts to punish Massachusetts and to punish the colonies for their actions. They're called the intolerable acts by the colonists. They take away the legislature of Massachusetts. It forces that they basically will have to pay back the money. They say that any British officer accused of a crime would be tried not in the colonies, but back in England or in Nova Scotia. Diet Dr. Pepper? Okay. All right. So with the coercive acts, also, especially the Quebec Act, which was not part of it, but it was a separate act for the organization of the Quebec colony, which had a lot of French-speaking people there. Therefore, they were Catholic, and it allowed them to openly practice their Catholic faith, and it did not give them a parliament or their own legislature. So the colonies thought that that was going to be what happened to them. So because of the coercive acts, the colonies decided to band together and form a Continental Congress. So the first Continental Congress meets in Philadelphia. They basically call for non-importation. They send a declaration of grievances to the king, but other than that, they don't have anything firmer, even though Massachusetts was asking for something. You also have the organization of loyalists, people that were loyal to the crown. And so basically around this time, you have about maybe up to a third of the colonists were patriots. They were pushing for changes. Some were even starting to talk about possibly independence. You have people that were loyal to the crown, and then probably about a third of the people were kind of neutral. The following spring, this is when the British march on Lexington and Concord just to get supplies of ammunition. This was the first shots of the Revolution.
What year is it?
1775. No. This is the shots heard around the world. A second Continental Congress meets in Philadelphia in May. The Battle of Bunker Hill occurs in June. And basically this was, the British tried to take a high ground over Boston from Patriots. The Patriots had to give up their forces and give up the hill, but the British took high losses. And so this was seen as kind of showed how the Patriots would stand up to this imperial army. They send an olive branch to the king that they want to settle the differences peacefully, but the king hears about this at the same time he hears about Battle of Bunker Hill and rejects it and says that anyone that's basically against the authority of the king was a traitor and would be hung. You also have Lord Dunmore, who was the royal governor of Virginia. Dunmore's a loyalist. And he makes a proclamation that offered freedom to slaves in Virginia.